My my
Sorry,
task to, my task today is to explain a little bit of why the building was created, what it was meant to support, the family business that I'll describe, and how it was used over the years, and then how it eventually came to be the nice home for the library that it is today. Um, Before we do that, I want to try to put the whole conversation in a context. And to me, that's the most interesting part of the story. What was going on in Jeff? What was the nature of the community that created an opportunity for a business that eventually led to the building that some of you are sitting in tonight? And to do that, I'd like you to use your imagination a little bit. And let's all go back to 1909 in Jeffersonville. This is an old postcard, and we're standing on the island across the iron bridge that's still there today. You're looking straight up Maple Avenue, and the building on the left is a store and also the post office for Jeffersonville in 1909. Now imagine yourself as a man of 27 years old coming out of his house on the island, hooking his horse to the carriage, going across the bridge and stopping in front of the post office. He pulls out his pocket watch, starts to get a little bit nervous because he's got to be to Liberty about 10:10 with with the bags of mail to catch the train that leaves at that time. He goes into the post office, has a quick chat with the postmaster, grabs the mail, secures it in the back of the carriage. Being nervous, he pulls out the clock again, checking the time, and he'd make it, but there's a stop in Liberty, or in Youngsville, and in White Sulphur to pick up some more mail. And he sure hopes that that very loquacious postmaster in Youngsville will let him make the trip. This scenario I just described for you, or something very similar to that, did in fact happen in 1909. The person involved was Fred Duttweiler, who happens to be my grandfather. And his very first commercial venture in transportation was to carry the mail from Jeff to Liberty and back twice a day to meet trains. Before we leave 1909, I'd like to use your imaginations again a little to think about what was Jeff like at that time. How were people making a living? What kind of commerce might you see if you walk down Main Street? How were people getting around at that point? What do you think Jeff might have been like? And I'll leave that as a rhetorical question, but hopefully in the next few slides, we'll detail that a bit to get a better sense of the context. So where I'm going to try to go in 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes or so, is to describe where the building that some of you are sitting in tonight came from, what was the context in which it was created, what was the business that supported it, and then eventually how the building came to be the library's home. And to do that, I can give you the short version, which I'll do right now. The library building was built in 1924 to support the transportation business that Fred Duttweiler built, to provide a lobby for passengers, a repair station for his vehicles, and a storage area for freight. It was used that way for almost 60 years. And when his son eventually then sold the business and then sold the building to the library. That's the short story. I could put some detail on it, but it's still kind of a boring story unless you think about what was going on in the community of Jeffersonville all the way through that, and how did that transportation business reflect what was the times of the day throughout that period. So I'm going to take kind of an indirect route to describe how the library building came to be and how it came from a commercial venture to the home of the library. Whenever I go to a presentation, I like to know a little bit about the person that's presenting. Some of you know me and know me well, but just to give you a little flavor, I was born in Calhoun, at the Calhoun Hospital, not the one on Route 97, but the one across the street from the firehouse up on the side hill. The building is still there. I grew up in Jeff, and those of you who are in the library, if you could see through the wall, right over your right shoulder, look across the street. The house on the corner of Center and Jefferson Avenue is where I grew up for my first 17 years. That house was my grandfather's house and then my father's house. So myself and my two sisters, Carol and Bobby. Bobby is online tonight to keep me honest through this presentation. That is us in a hammock right outside that house. My spouse is also from Jeff, Linda Redington. She happens to be online tonight as well. Her parents, George and Joan Redington, ran George's Colonial Inn and Bowling Alley on Main Street for many years. Last I looked, it was Catskill Outfitters or a sporting goods store of some kind. I did graduate from Jeff Youngsville. The picture on the right is me and my best friend, John Boxberger, sporting our bright orange JYCS jerseys. I did work in the family business as a helper on the trucks. And then just before I went away to college, I did do some bus driving and some truck driving towards the tail end of the business. And my professional career, I actually took a little bit of Jeffersonville with me. I studied fisheries and aquatic sciences, and I attribute that directly to many hours playing in the Catskill Creek in Jeff. I'm retired from Cornell Cooperative Extension as an adult educator. So enough about what I'm about. Again, telling a story, I think it's nice to know a little bit about the cast of characters. And I'm not going to spend a lot of detail on this, but a key character was Fred Duttweiler. His family was among those people from Switzerland who came to Jeffersonville in the 1840s and 1850s. There's some very interesting stories there about land swindles and burning cabins and loss of a child en route to Jeff. I'll save those for the tail end if anybody's interested, but suffice it to say, it was a true immigrant kind of story. Fred initially worked on the family farm up on Swiss Hill, but eventually did build the business that we'll be spending some time with tonight. The next key person was Russell Duttweiler. That's my father. I love that picture in the middle. It sort of conveys the changing of the generations, the handing off of the business from one to the other. In 1953, my father assumed the business that we'll explore tonight. And then one other person who makes a cameo visit in the story of the library building. It's Fred Jacobs, Charles Jacobs. By his outfit, you might be able to guess what his profession was. He was a blacksmith. And I'll clue you in how he intersects with the library building story a little bit later. When I started to try to assemble the history of the family business a number of years ago, I had some real misconceptions, or maybe more accurately, some real ignorances about what Jeff was like, what the nature of living was like at that time. And what I found when I did my detective work was that Jeff was far from the sleepy community that I thought it was. It was a bustling commercial community that its strategic location midway between the Ontario and Western Railway and the Erie Railway in Calhoun had a lot to do with the activity that was there. I knew about guest lodging, boarding houses and the like, but I had no clue to the extent of that activity at the time the business was started. And then lastly, I had this impression that in 1909 or so, there couldn't have been much activity with automobiles, but I was absolutely wrong on that one. Automobiles were well established in the community by that time. So what I'd like to take you through is some of the evidence that I got of this very vibrant little community of Jeffersonville. And one of the ways I did that was to go to the newspaper archives and just looked at ads that were posted. And I chose 1912 because that's when my grandfather's business really started to take off. And so you don't strain your eyes. I'll let you know what some of the things are here. There are two different surgeons and doctors, and sort of a nice balance to that. There are two different undertakers in town at the time. So we had both ends of the spectrum in terms of care. There was a drugstore, there was a plumbing store, a watchmaker, three different organization or facilities dealing with cars. There were insurance agents, a shoe store, a grocery store, a hardware store. Just about any kind of commerce that you might think you'd need was represented in Jeff at that time. So much different picture than I went into this process with. One ad in particular caught my attention. It's the one, the little circle just appeared, and it's Jeffersonville Motor Car Company. So this is 3 years after my grandfather started the mail carrying. He had established his company and was not only providing transportation, but also sort of branching out into selling automobile supplies. It's a little bit of a reach because it says motor car company, but he didn't actually incorporate for 7 more years after that. It was operated more informally in these early years. So that was one kind of evidence I found about the activity around Jeff. The other dimension that I really should have known a lot more about, because it turns out that both sides of my family were actively involved in the boarding house business. And the picture at the lower left is Maple Grove, which was built by Philip Jacobs, my great-great-grandfather, and operated by Philip L. Jacobs, my great-grandfather. This was on what's now Route 52 on the right-hand side, just before you get to Youngsville. And this operated long enough that my mother talked about assisting with kitchen chores and with guest care in that particular boarding house. On the right is a boarding house that was operated by the Duttweilers up on Swiss Hill. It'd be near the intersection of Swiss Hill Road and Goebel Road. It was built and expanded multiple times. It ended its life. Ann Mages ran it as a guest home. We can't quite figure out when that stopped, but it was well past the 50s before that particular facility stopped serving guests. So with that kind of background, I should have known a lot more about the boarding house businesses than I did. But just to get us thinking about this, here's a question. In 1917, there were 3 hotels and at least 2 boarding houses right in the village of Jeffersonville. And about how many more boarding houses might there have been in the surrounding area? And just sort of wrap your head around that. We'll leave it as a rhetorical question. But what I found when I finally found a document that spelled out just how many facilities there were was these many boarding houses in the immediate area of Jeff. So right in the village, right around the village, 20 plus, all the way along the route that Duttweiler was carrying passengers, nearly 100 or more boarding houses operating at the time that he started the bus service. So again, I grossly underestimated what the activity was in that arena. So the picture you start to get about Jeff is very different from the one I went into this with. On the left is a picture of the 1920s in the Main Street If you could read the fine print on some of the stores, there's a shoe store, there's a grocery store, there's a hardware store, there's a full garage and gas station on the right. And if you jump forward another 10 years or so, after the Jeff Dam was placed in 1927, Lake Jeff became a very active destination. This must have been some kind of a celebration to have that density of participants, but you can see that Jeff really was serving as a center of activity. Um, Notice that all the vehicles look pretty similar in that picture on the right. That leads me to believe that a lot of the people who were there were from the boarding houses because they were very typical touring cars that served the various boarding houses around the area. So again, the picture that I developed with a little homework is Jeff as a very active community. Here's another way to get a picture of the level of activity. This is the O&W station in Liberty, and it was documented that as early as 1901, more than 200 cars and carriages would meet the trains at the peak time in the summer tourist seasons. And if you can barely make it out, but in the back of the picture, there's literally hundreds of people awaiting the train there in Liberty. And I think seeing this every day that he took the mail to the railroad station had to do with some of the inspiration that Fred Duttweiler had to start the bus service. And for all I know, the little bus sitting right in the front could very well be one of his. And I'll show you why I think that could be the case in a few more slides. But again, the picture I'm trying to paint is not only was Jeff an active place, it was a place that could support the kind of business that Fred Duttweiler did eventually develop. I wanted to try to fix you in terms of location of the library building with this particular slide. And I'm not sure how well it shows. Yeah, I guess I can see the pointer. This picture is Main Street running this way. Silver Heights up in here, up onto Swiss Hill. And this is Center Street. I can tell this is before 1918 because this building is the Eagle Hotel, and here's Beck's store. And those two buildings plus two others burned in 1918. So that fixes the date of this postcard to prior to 1918. As we come down along Center Street, this house right here is the one I grew up in. It was one of the Scheidel houses. This also was a Scheidel house. The Scheidels owned this whole property going up the hill. Remember the picture of me in the hammock? Well, the hammock was on the side of this woodshed right here. Across the street from the house, hidden by the trees, is what was the firehouse, the community firehouse, and is now the village hall. So those of you in the library, across your right-hand shoulder is where the firehouse is, the same building that's there presently. And one thing you can't see, because I haven't found a clear picture of it, is at the back of this field was a small blacksmith shop, which comes into the picture as we go to some of the land acquisitions for the library building, the garage building. Let me turn off the pointer. One of the mysteries I had, and I just think I figured it out this week, is where was he operating the business before he developed the garage that became the library? And what I found was the Sanborn insurance maps. These are maps that were done in 1918 and then repeated in the 20s and 30s, where they attempted to map every building. They marked what they were made of, and where they could, they marked what the function of the building was. We're looking down on the same spot that the first postcard I showed you was, looking across Calhoun Creek. This is the island to the right. What says Wampus Lane is now Lovett Lane. And this building, you just placed the circle on, is where Fred Duttweiler and Helen Egler Duttweiler lived once they married in 1912. This was their house. It was the Doach house when I was growing up. I don't know who's in it now. But when I looked carefully at the map, I found two things on the same property. And both of these are marked auto garage. And I believe that this is where Fred Duttweiler was operating his business, doing his repairs, selling his auto parts out of, and using the lot for parking facilities. And if you think about it, it's off the beaten trail from Main Street. It's not very accommodating for guests if you're trying to transport passengers. He probably was picking up his passengers at one of the hotels or other designated area, but it was just totally insufficient for operating a business. And that is where the idea of developing a building that would eventually become the library came to be. I'm not going to give a lot of detail on the business, but I wanted to give you a little bit of the timeline to some of the major developments, just to give a good flavor for what the business was that led to the library building. We already know that he started the business with carrying mail. Within 2 years, he was carrying passengers from Jeff to Liberty and back, meeting 2 trains a day. At first, it was sort of ad hoc. He'd make arrangements with some of the boarding houses, but by 1912, that was a regularly scheduled service. And if the little card on the right is one of his first business cards for that scheduled service. I circled the language because I think it's kind of interesting that they're using the old language and the new language together. It's still called a stage from the horse and buggy days, but linking that with automobile stage. In the 1920s, he bypassed the railroads by doing direct routes from Jeffersonville to New York City. A regular route twice a day, buses would go back and forth. And that was when he really kicked into high gear in terms of the bus business. In the 1930s, he expanded that to include charter operations that went nationwide. And again, I'll show you some evidence of that in a few minutes. Freight hauling was part of the business from the beginning, all the way up through the 60s. And it took different forms. A lot of that time it was carrying groceries from New York and then redistributing them across western Sullivan and into northeastern Pennsylvania. And the freight closed out with hauling dairy products from Crowley's milk to support the hotel business in the Catskills in the 60s and 70s. That went from as many as 4 tractor trailers a day in the summer and eventually tailed off. If you know the history of the Sullivan County hotels, you know that the 60s and 70s are when the hotels started to close and the business wound down, and so did our trucking business for that type of work. School buses were part of the business all the way from the start, organizing school trips even before centralization of the schools. And then once centralization happened, regular contracts to move students for particularly the Jeff district. And all of that wound down in the 1980s when the business was eventually sold. Why don't I stop and just take a breath? Sierra, I can't see the chat right now, so if there anything was popped in there as a comment or a question?
No, there's nothing.
Okay. Obviously, I get on a roll, so feel free to break in if something comes up.
Okay.
If I tried to detail that history I just ran through, I'm pretty sure I put everybody to sleep going through the steps and stages of that. So what I came up with instead, I thought it might be a little more interesting, is to tell a little bit more about the story by using pictures of the vehicles involved. And so I'll show vehicles from the various stages of the business. Uh, uh, on the left on this one is Fred Duttweiler with his mail service. And in the winter, the roads were so horrible and not maintained that the better option when there was a heavy snowstorm was to use a sled. And that sled is what's called a cutter. So that's where the title for my little book comes from, Cutters to Motor Coaches. On the right-hand side is the very first bus that he bought, which is the 1911 Model T. And it looks suspiciously close to the bus that was parked in that picture of the Ontario and Western train station a few slides back. But this is what he used to initially on an ad hoc basis pick up passengers, and then shortly after a scheduled basis running between Jeff and Liberty. These are some of the other vehicles, and they represent a different part of the business. The guest lodging business largely consisted of women and children coming up to the country in the beginning of the summer, staying through the summer, and then going back home while spouses stayed in the city working. That's just the way it was at that point in time. But if you think about families stuck in a boarding house, they often might like to get out and wander around a bit. And that was the touring cars kind of idea, that he'd get a call from one of the local boarding houses saying, I've got 6 passengers who'd like to go see the Ashokan Dam, which is exactly what the picture in the upper left is. The Ashokan Dam was finished in 1915, amazing engineering feat, and it really was a tourism draw for a long time. That particular vehicle happens to be a Rio Speedwagon. And any boomers in the group tonight might remember a band called REO Speedwagon. Oh, that's what it was named after, that particular vehicle. But it was a nice little bus with a convertible top. If you're interested in kinds of cars, the one to its right, the little coupe, was a 30 Whippet. The next is a 26 Essex. At the bottom is a 26 Durant. And at the bottom right is a 28 Studebaker. It was pretty obvious by the mix of vehicles. He was finding whatever he could, where he could, to patch together a fleet. The little coupe in the middle would be used as a taxi service around town. And there's, if you may be able to see, there's an interesting graphic on the side of the spare tire. It's a Art Deco version of a face. And that was drawn by my uncle, Harold Duttweiler. That whole generation had some artistic talents that skipped me for some reason, but I found it interesting that that's where the graphic came from. Moving on, as I said before, freight was part of the business right from the start, and the vehicle in the upper left is the first truck that Fred had in his fleet. It's a 1910 Hewitt. And a couple things that I found interesting about it. It's a chain drive vehicle. So right in front of the rear wheel, you can see the chain cover. That thing must have been a beast to shift. There was no differential. It was a direct gear drive. It had a couple of gear options on it, but it must have been something else to try to drive that. And Fred is standing at the front of the vehicle, and another thing I found interesting was right next to his knee is the crank. So not only might that have been a challenging vehicle to drive, it must have been something else to try to get it going as well. In the upper right is what the fleet started to look like just before the garage was built. So here we are right in front of the house on the corner of Jefferson and Center. And the vehicles that are there are a couple of Studebaker buses, a couple of the touring cars, and even some of the taxis. So that's what the fleet was starting to look like when the need for the garage became apparent. And then down at the bottom is sort of the top of the line version of the bus services. These were yellow coaches. Yellow coach was later bought out by GM, but they'd be the equivalent to the big fancy buses that are running up and down the roads today. Just really beautiful vehicles, very comfortable inside. And if you were able to see the writing on the side of the bus in front, it says Talk Vacation Tours. And what Fred was able to do, because of his connections to New York and connections to various bus manufacturers, he got in early on the vacation tour business. And he'd line up with companies that organize tours all over the country and provide the bus services. And I'll give you a good example of that in this next slide. This is one of his vehicles in the Redwoods in California. And this particular group, the Manganini Chamber Symphony, Manganini was a music prof at Columbia who traveled his orchestra all over the country, and Fred Duttweiler's vehicles were what took him around. He also carried some vaudeville shows, some talent shows, and as well as general charters for vacation tourism. So that was sort of the peak of the bus services. After this, some of the major bus lines came of age, like Greyhound and what would become Trailways, and they outcompeted for some of the regular scheduled routes. So by the 40s, that kind of work started to phase out of the business. Just to give a little bit more on the trucking side of things, Al Stepek, you mentioned the Mack truck that you rode in. I think that's it in the upper right, the 1950s Mack. But you also see to the left of that an early version of a tractor trailer from the 30s. And then down at the bottom, one of the typical straight job trucks. Remember the one down at the bottom, because I'll bring him back in the story a little bit later. On the left is the firehouse, which is now the village hall. And you may be able to see there's a couple of fire engines parked out front. But you also, what is a little hard to see because it's a dark picture, but there are 6 of Duttweiler's vehicles scattered around the firehouse. And this is one of the pictures that made me wonder why we weren't run out of town, because the business sort of took over the whole street, as you'll see even further in some additional pictures. I sort of described the business as a straight line, sort of evolution. Things didn't always go so smoothly, and so I wanted to give you a more honest picture of what the business was like. And remember that first bus? Well, it didn't have such a great ending. It caught on fire on the way to Liberty, and it just happens that one of my great uncles, August Newberger, was a professional photographer, so he documented the demise of that first bus very well. If you were a passenger in those early days, you never quite knew what you were in for. This is that same bus stuck in a snowbank with all the passengers trying to pull it out of the drift so they could keep going to Liberty. There were a number of accidents along the way, and in the Sullivan County Record archives, I found 4 different references to accidents that Fred himself had. Up in the top middle, one of the buses rolled, fortunately, with no kids in it. The driver claimed a bee flew in the window, but we never quite accepted that version. The picture on the right are the rear ends of my father and grandfather trying to fix a Buick coupe that ran into a tree. So things didn't always go smoothly in the business. Other things happened as well. On one of the trips to New York, Fred was robbed of all the fares. There were lawsuits along the way. One case, a crankshaft blew in one of the touring cars and injured a woman pretty seriously. Um, and some of the freighting jobs that were obtained, uh, there was a meeting place in New York City where people who needed freight to be moved would meet with the various companies, and they'd bid it out right there on the floor. And apparently it got rather rowdy, and at least 2 times there were references to fistfights that happened. Unfortunately, I also know of 2 incidents where there were fatal accidents involved. So running a business wasn't always a whole lot of fun. Don't strain your eyes to try to read these. I'll summarize what each of these little articles has to say, but I'm shifting now from the nature of the business to the library building itself, the garage and library building. And the action started to happen in January of 1924. This is from the Sullivan County Record, and it reports that Duttweiler purchased from one of the Scheidel family the house and the lot across from what was described as the future garage site. So this is the house on the corner of Center Street and Jefferson Ave. And he was said to be looking for a lot to erect a depot, a waiting room for passengers, and a storehouse for freight. So those were the 3 functions that led to the building of the library building. And then only a few months later, in May of 2024, Fred purchased the blacksmith shop opposite and the lot, and that was the lot on which the library now stands. As I said before, I haven't found a picture of the blacksmith shop, but the small world connection back to my other grandfather is that Fred Jacobs operated that blacksmith shop for a number of years prior to the time that Fred Duttweiler purchased the lot. During that time, Fred Jacobs was operating the blacksmith shop. He met someone by the name of Lenora Bolenbach. The Bolenbachs owned the mill on Mill Street. Lenora was one of the daughters. She became my grandmother, so I wouldn't be speaking to you tonight if there weren't that small world connection to the property that the library stands on. So again, the library building was built in 1924. The functions were a passenger terminal, an office, a bus and truck garage, and a freight warehouse. It was modified over several different times and eventually linked to the firehouse next door. So let's take a look at first what the building looked like. This is shortly after the building was constructed. It should look pretty familiar because the lines are identical to what they are today. The attic was never fully developed. There was, I think, about half of it had a floor in it. And I remember things like extra fenders, ladders, and rollers for moving freight, that kind of thing stored up there. But it was never really that actively used. The main floor, I'll show you how it was divided up, but that's where most of the activity was. Downstairs was wide open. There was a huge old furnace that serviced what was the passenger area upstairs and the workshop. But where those of you who are in the library was open. I remember big piles of extra tires there. If he was doing something like rebuilding a motor, it was the chassis was probably sitting right about where you're sitting tonight in the library building. You can see in the second picture the relationship to the fire hall. It hasn't moved. It's still there today. You can see the signs for buses and taxis and trucks. There was a gas station right about where that sign, a gas pump right about where that sign is. And in the back, you might be able to make out a couple of vehicles parked under the overhang. This is what the original floor plan was. The ramp was just in the middle of the front of the building. So you could drive up in there, park vehicles or offload freight. To the right, it was down at street level and you could park a couple of vehicles under there. On the left, there were steps that went up to a lobby. And that's where the passengers could purchase tickets and wait for the buses twice a day. And in the back, towards the parking lot behind you, for those of you who are in the community room tonight, was where a workshop was for vehicle repairs and the like. The first modification, and I think I can just about remember this, was to extend the ramp all the way across, remove the passenger area because that was a bygone phenomena at this point, and open up the workshop from front to back. So now you could drive vehicles in all the way across the garage. The next modification, and I remember this very well, was connection with the firehouse. It was no longer a firehouse. The firehouse on Main Street had been built. For a while, Casper Egler had a bunch of sewing machines in the building, and a dress manufacturing company operated there for a while. But after that, my father used it just as a garage for vehicles. A storage area and loading dock was built out back, and that was made it easier to handle groceries for reloading and distribution. And by that time, school buses were inspected every year, and the state began requiring that there be a pit, a place for the inspectors to be able to get under the buses. So that was really the instigation for connecting the two buildings as they are today. So just a couple more pictures to convey the same kind of developments. And the one on the left, here's the other picture that I wondered why they didn't run us out of town, taking over all of Center Street. But you can see groceries being transferred between two different trucks in the front. As far as the garage building, on the left side, you can still see steps up to a door, and that's where the passengers would go and wait to get on the bus. And on the right, this is moving fast forward to, it has to be the late 60s, because I think that's a 1965 GMC in the front, which is one of the trucks that I wound up driving. In the back, you might be able to see the box truck backed up against the pier that connected the garage with the firehouse. And they would be in the process of moving groceries that had been brought up from New York City onto the little trucks to go out and be distributed. So that this picture, I think, gives you a good sense of sort of the utility of the building once the two sides were connected. And just a couple more pictures to show you the then and now. Obviously, a lot of modification to the front, but the roof line is identical. The overhead space is identical, but it's now a wonderful facility for the library. I gave you sort of a sterile description of the business in the garage. I wanted to give you a little bit more personality of the garage, particularly from the standpoint of a kid who grew up across the street. If you think about a garage full of trucks and buses and a little boy, you can pretty much get an idea of what the garage was to me. I'd scoot across the street and climb up into the trucks and buses and pretend I was driving all over the country. And it was especially fun when the cousins from Syracuse came down and all of us would wander around and create these imaginary journeys. Well, that lasted about as long as the first dead battery in a bus that my father discovered. And also shortly after I discovered that anything with an air horn had at least one good horn blast left in it, even with the engine off. We were banned from the garage after that point. When we were primarily in the basketball business, the garage would be completely empty when the buses were out on their routes. So I'd run down the hill after school, and I had a basketball hoop mounted in the garage and would have a blast running around shooting baskets until my brother-in-law, Danny Fisher, who had the Kohlertown bus route, and would get back much before any of the other buses would join in, and we had basketball tournaments, contests almost every evening after the bus route. So you can envision the main desk in the library and us shooting foul shots from right about there against the wall. The garage was a working automobile repair shop, and as such, I had some hazards with it. I always remember my father cutting this or burning that, coming home with holes in his pants. Some were more serious incidents. The garage roof needed painting once, and I remember my father scurrying around up on the roof. But I also remember one of the workmen who had been carrying tar sitting at the bottom of the ladder and had twisted his leg and broken his leg in that venture. So there are some stories about the garage that weren't happy work stories. The worst of which was my father and Uncle Bud, Howard Jacobs, were replacing springs in one of the trucks, and Bud did exactly what you're never supposed to do, but it's almost psychologically impossible not to do, which was to test the alignment of the springs with his finger. I don't think I have to tell you the rest of the story, but his manicures were easier after that the incident. So the garage has some interesting tales. The last of which I tell you is back to this truck I showed you before. 1947 Diamond T, and one of the businesses with freight was to take groceries to the camps in northeastern Pennsylvania. And they all wanted their groceries right away in the morning. So we would load the trucks up at night and then for security purposes, park them in the garage. Well, one night, the truck must have been parked perfectly between two floor joists, because had you walked into the garage the next morning, about where you're sitting tonight, those of you in the library, you would have seen a pile of concrete and looked up and seen the rear axle of a truck right through the floor. And if you went upstairs tonight, peeled back whatever the flooring is, you probably could still see the concrete patch in the floor. So the garage had some adventures over the course of its life. And I just wanted to give you a little flavor of that as well. All right, we're in the home stretch here. The business started to tail off in the 70s. Freight operations pretty much dried up. In terms of groceries, the food production firms started to buy into their own freight shipping, so cut out the local contractors. By 1981, my father had just about enough. And at 62, he decided it was time to sell off the buses so he and my mother could do more of their favorite activity, which was travel around in their Airstream. So the business essentially closed down in 1981. And in 1982, the building was sold to the library. I'll read from you just a little bit of the history. I heard earlier, Sierra and a couple of folks there were talking about when the library started and when the transition happened. So I just have a paragraph off the history from the library website. The Lions Club initiated creation of a library in Jeff in the 1970s. In 1979, the Jeffersonville Memorial Reading Center was reorganized as the Ramapo Catskill Library System Reading Center. It opened in Kohlertown in a rented building in 1980. Jeffersonville Public Library Board purchased the Duttweiler Garage in 1982. Renovations were made with much assistance from the community, and it moved to its present location in 1983. So that closes the circle on the history of the business and the garage. There's a lot more stories to be told, and a lot of them are in the little book, Cutters to Motor Coaches. Those of you who are in the library can pick up a copy. If anyone else who's online would like to receive one, there's my email address, which you're welcome to drop me a line, and we'll figure out a way to get you a copy. And or if you just have any questions you'd like follow-up on. I'd just like to comment on the two images that are appearing at this point. The vehicle on the right isn't my grandfather's, but it's exactly like one that he had. It's a 1955 DeSoto. It was a touring car in the sense that it had a big bench seat in the back and two jump seats that dropped down. And as late as the mid 1950s, he would still occasionally run passengers for some of the boarding houses. I think he did it because he loved the interaction with the people and had these relationships with boarding houses forever. But the way I remember that vehicle is, again, when the Syracuse Cousins came, we all loaded up in this and every day went up to Lake Onawanda to go swimming. So that's my memory. The last memory I have of the business side of my grandfather. That's just a really fun memory. And then the other image, I'm going to get out of screen sharing to show you something. And what I am showing you is the very pocket watch, which 115 years ago, my grandfather used to keep time with the railroad. And I wound it up this morning. It's still working perfectly. It's one of my prized possessions. And it's a fun way to remember my grandfather and father, the fun business, the interesting business they developed, and what a great way it was to grow up as a kid. So that's my story, folks. I'm sticking to it. If anybody has questions or comments, I'd be happy to try to take them.
There's one comment in the chat from Ginny Davis.
Uh-huh.
She said, my maternal grandfather commuted from New York City to Ferndale weekly using the O&W Railroad.
That's fun. Yeah.
Do any of you have questions?
I don't have a question, but I think the first time I knew much about you was when you were a really good buddy with my brother Danny Bowen.
Yes, I remember for sure.
Playing Baby Crockett and Danny Boone.
I think I have a picture of that somewhere, Nancy.
And your wife played the organ for our wedding. So thank you.
Well, you made her look crosswise. She's trying to remember here.
Well, it was about 60 years ago.
Well, I've worked for a lot of people, and but your dad, Russell, was one of the nicest people I ever worked for. He was decent to work for. He was fair, and I have a lot of good memories of him.
Well, thanks for saying that, Al. It's very nice of you. And I do remember when you were working on the trucks. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I hope there was something of interest in this for you.